A baby was dying in my arms on a stagecoach in the Wyoming Territory, and the man who had brought him aboard had given up. Nobody on that coach knew the child's name. Nobody knew his father's name either. Nobody, that is, except me, because the folded letter in my lap had been written by the very man whose son was about to die 3 feet from my knees. Let me tell you how I got there. The summer of 1882 came down on the Wyoming Territory like a hammer on hot iron. Dust rose from the wagon road and slow yellow clouds hung in the still air and settled on everything that passed beneath the white bowl of the sky. The stagecoach from Cheyenne to Lander had been moving since before dawn, and the wheels had found every rut and stone in the long road north. Inside the coach, 6 passengers swayed against one another in the heat, and the leather curtains slapped weakly at the open windows, and no one spoke because, in the middle of all that silence and all that heat, there was a sound that no one inside that wooden box could escape. A baby was crying, not the small, fussy crying of a hungry child, not the sleepy whimper of a child who wanted only to be rocked. This was the crying of a creature at the far end of its small strength, a thin, sharp wail that rose and rose again, and every man and woman in the coach had been listening to it for more than 4 hours. One of the men, a whiskered cattle buyer in a stained black coat, pressed his hat down over his eyes and muttered something that was not a prayer. Another, a young drummer with sample cases stacked at his feet, kept rubbing the bridge of his nose as if the sound were a thorn lodged there. A heavy woman in a brown bonnet had given up making faces of sympathy and now only stared straight ahead at nothing. Pressed into the corner nearest the window sat a young woman in a navy blue traveling dress. Her name was Adelaide Thornberry. She was 22 years old, and she had been on the road from Boston for 9 days, and her hands folded in her lap on top of a much-folded letter were so still they might have belonged to a porcelain doll. Her hair, the color of honey held up to lamplight, had come loose from its pins beneath her bonnet. There was dust on her cheek that she had not yet thought to brush away. Her eyes, large in the soft color of cornflowers in summer, were fixed on the dark bundle of blanket in the lap of the man across from her, and they had not moved from it in nearly an hour. The man holding the baby was named Hank Mercer. He was perhaps 50, with skin like saddle leather and gray stubble on his cheeks, and he was a ranch hand in the employ of a family called Cowboy, who lived somewhere up in the high country northwest of Lander. He had told Adelaide as much when the coach had stopped at the way station that morning. He had not told her then that the bundle in his arms was dying, but Adelaide knew it now. She had known it for at least 2 hours. The cry had changed. That was how she knew. It had begun fierce and angry, the cry of a healthy infant whose needs were not being met, and that was the kind of cry a mother could endure. But somewhere past noon, the cry had thinned. It had grown frayed at the edges, the way a piece of cloth grows frayed when it has been pulled too long against a nail, and now it came in shorter bursts with longer silences between, and the silences were what frightened Adelaide most. Each silence was a little longer than the one before. Each silence was the small body in that blanket asking whether it was worth the work to draw the next breath. Adelaide knew all of this because Adelaide had spent 8 years of her life inside the nursery of the St. Margaret Home for Foundlings on the south side of Boston, and she had heard this exact sound before. She had heard it more times than she could count. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the heat and the swaying of the coach take her back to the place she had come from, the place she had been running from. She was 6 years old again in her memory, and the building she had lived in with her mother and father was burning, and a fireman with a mustache like a scrub brush was carrying her down a wooden staircase that was already eating itself in flame. After that, there had been the orphanage and the long beige corridors that smelled of lye soap, and Sister Bernadette with her kind chapped hands, and the row of wooden cradles in the nursery, where Adelaide had been sent as a helper at 14 years of age because she had a calm voice and steady hands, and the baby stopped crying when she held them. For 8 years she had walked those rows of cradles. She had held babies who were too small for the world and who slipped out of it before morning. She had held babies left at the gate by mothers who could not bear to look back. She had pressed her finger into 100 small palms in the dark and she had whispered things into 100 small ears that no one else would ever hear. She had grown up, in fact, knowing more about how to keep a tiny human being alive than most grown women in Boston knew. And she had grown up knowing also that no one was going to keep her. Not the sisters who were kind, but who had 30 other girls to think of. Not the women who came once a year to look the older girls over for service positions. Not anyone. When her contract with St. Margaret had ended 6 weeks ago, the Mother Superior had pressed $40 into her hand in a small carpet bag and had told her gently that the world outside was waiting. The world outside, Adelaide had discovered very quickly, was not waiting at all. It did not even know she existed. She had walked into the office of a registry that placed governesses with the better Boston families, and the woman behind the desk had looked at her dress and her shoes and the worn carpet bag and had told her without unkindness that those positions were not for girls like her. It was that night in a boarding house room she could afford for only 3 more days that Adelaide had opened the Boston Herald and seen the small advertisement in the column at the back. Wanted a respectable woman of good character for a homestead in the Wyoming Territory. Mountain country, hard living, honest man. Reply Mr. Silas Calloway by way of the Lander Post. She had answered that very evening by candlelight, her hands shaking. The reply had come 3 weeks later in heavy mountain handwriting, slow and careful. The letters formed like a man laying stones for a wall. The letter had said few things, and what it said simply, he was a rancher. He lived high in the Wind River Range. He could offer a home and food in his name and his protection. He could not offer pretty things. He could not offer society. He could offer only what he had, and what he had he would share fully. There would be no falsehoods between them, the letter said. He would treat her with the respect a wife deserved. He hoped she would consider his offer. Adelaide had read the letter 4 times in a row. Then she had gone to her knees beside the iron bed in the boarding house room, and she had wept for almost an hour. Not because she was frightened, but because, for the first time in 22 years, someone she had never met had written her a letter that contained the word home in it. She had spent her last good dollars on the train ticket west, and now she was here in the heat and the dust of the high country with the folded letter still in her lap and a dying child crying 3 feet from her knees. She opened her eyes. Hank Mercer was not looking at the baby anymore. He was looking out the window. His face had the gray-set look of a man who has seen too many bad endings and who is steeling himself for one more. The baby in his arms made a sound that was not quite a cry, more like a small sigh given up to the world, and Hank flinched as though he had been struck. Adelaide stood up. The coach swayed and she nearly fell, but she caught the leather strap above the window and steadied herself, and she crossed the small space between them. The other passengers turned to watch her with the dull curiosity of people who have been bored for too long. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "please let me hold the child." Hank looked up at her. His eyes were wet. "Miss, I don't reckon there's anything to be done. He won't take the bottle. He hasn't taken the bottle since yesterday morning. The wet nurse in Lander, she fell sick a week back, and I took the boy down to Cheyenne hoping to find another. And there ain't a woman in 3 counties willing to take on a stranger's baby this far from her own kitchen. We're going home empty-handed. I am not asking to feed him, Mr. Mercer. I am asking to hold him, please." He hesitated for one more second, and then he passed her the small, warm bundle of blanket and weight. And Adelaide took the baby into her arms and sat back down on the bench with him. The first thing she felt was how light he was. He was perhaps 8 or 9 weeks old by her trained guess, and a healthy infant of that age should have been a pleasant ache in her arms. This child weighed almost nothing. He was warm, but it was the wrong kind of warmth, the dry, papery warmth of a body that has gone too long without water. She did not need to undo the blanket to know what she would find. She knew the small skin would tent under her finger when she lifted it. She knew the lips would be cracked. She knew the soft place at the top of his head would be sunken in a way that no soft place at the top of an infant's head should ever be. "What is his name, Mr. Mercer?" Hank shook his head. He ain't got one yet. His mama died before they could pick. His pa hasn't been able to say a name out loud since. Adelaide looked down at the small creature in her arms. He was not crying anymore. That should not have been a comfort. She knew it was not a comfort. She had seen babies stop crying in just this way in the long beige corridor of St. Margaret's, and she knew what came after the stopping if no one acted. She drew in a slow breath and bent her head and spoke to the child very softly in the voice she had used 1,000 times in another life, in another nursery, half a continent away. You listen to me now, little one. You listen carefully. I do not know what they have called you, and I do not know what name your father will give you. But I know you and I have known 100 boys just like you, and none of you ever did get to quit on me. You hear I am not a quitting woman, and you are not going to be a quitting boy. We have not even been introduced yet, you and you are not allowed to leave before the introduction. That is not how it is done in polite company. She did not know if she was smiling or crying as she said it. Possibly both. Then she set to work. She unpinned the small silver brooch at her throat, the cameo of her mother. That was the only thing in this world she owned that her mother had touched. She set it carefully on the seat beside her. She loosened the lace at her collar. From the inside of her sleeve, where she had stitched a small, clean handkerchief that morning, out of long habit, she drew out a square of fine white linen. She tore a strip from it, the sound of the tearing very loud in the silent coach. The whiskered cattle buyer was watching her now with his hat back on his head. The woman in the brown bonnet had leaned forward. Mr. Mercer, the bottle. Miss, I told you he won't. The bottle, Mr. Mercer. He gave her the bottle. It was a stoppered glass thing with a rubber teat, and the milk inside it had gone warm in the heat of the coach. Adelaide opened her small carpet bag with one hand and took out the twist of paper in which she had folded a few precious lumps of brown sugar in case she could not afford a meal at a way station. She crushed one lump between her fingers and dropped it into the bottle and shook it gently until the sugar was gone. Then she dipped the strip of linen into the milk and let it grow heavy with it. She brought the wet corner of the linen to the baby's lips. For a long moment, nothing happened. The baby did not stir. The whole coach was silent except for the creak of the wheels and the steady fall of the horse's hooves on the road. Adelaide bent her face very close to the small face in her arms, and she whispered, "Come now, little one. Just one swallow, just one. I will be here for the next one and the next one and every one after that. But you have to give me the first one. You have to meet me halfway." The small mouth moved. It moved against the linen. It moved as though remembering very faintly what mouths were for. And then the small throat worked, and a single swallow went down. Adelaide felt it the way you feel a held breath finally let go. She wet the linen again. She brought it again. The mouth moved again. Another swallow. Another. 5 minutes passed. 10. The baby in her arms began to drink in small, slow sips from the corner of the cloth, and after a while she risked offering the bottle itself, and on the third try the small lips closed around the rubber teat and held there, and the baby began to feed. The whiskered cattle buyer made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else, and put his hat over his face. The woman in the brown bonnet pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Hank Mercer was staring at Adelaide as though she had just walked out of a stained glass window in a church. "Miss," he said, his voice gone thick and strange. "Miss, what is your name?" Adelaide did not look up from the small face in her arms. She was watching the throat work, and the small fingers began very slowly to find their grip on the world again. "Adelaide Thornberry." "Ma'am, that boy's pa is going to want to know your name. That boy's pa is going to want to write that name down in his Bible." Adelaide finally looked up. She looked across at Hank Mercer, and she said very quietly, "Mr. Mercer, who is that boy's father?" And Hank Mercer said, "His name is Silas Calloway, miss." The coach went on. The wheels turned. The dust rose. Adelaide Thornberry sat in her seat in her dusty navy blue traveling dress, with her mother's cameo on the bench beside her and a sleeping child in her arms, and she did not move at all because she could not, because the entire shape of her future had just been pulled out from under her like a rug, and she did not yet know what the floor beneath it would feel like under her feet. Silas Calloway, the man whose letter was folded in her lap, the man she had crossed a continent to marry, the man who, according to his own slow, careful handwriting, had promised her a home and food, in his name and his protection. The man who had not seen fit to tell her in any of his careful sentences that there was a child waiting at the end of her journey, a child whose mother was already in the ground. A small, hot tear slid down her cheek and fell onto the blanket. She did not wipe it away. She bent her head over the small face and she whispered something that no one else in the coach could hear. "You stay alive, little one. You stay alive, and I will sort the rest of it out. I promise." The road to land had climbing gently through grassland and then more steeply through pine forest. As the afternoon wore on, the Wind River Mountains rose in the west, blue and white and immense, with snow still clinging to the highest peaks even in August. Adelaide watched the country come at her through the open window of the coach and could not make her mind hold still. Every time she tried to think about what she would say to Silas Calloway, when she met him, the words slipped out of her hands like water. Every time she tried to think about what she would do if he sent her back, her stomach went cold. She had no money to go back. The $40 from the Mother Superior was nearly gone. The boarding house in Boston was gone. The nursery at St. Margaret's was gone. There was nothing behind her but a closed door. The baby slept in her arms. He slept for a long time, the deep, healing sleep of a small body that has been allowed at last to rest. Twice during the afternoon, she woke him gently to give him more of the sugared milk, and twice he took it without complaint. The dry, papery warmth of his skin was fading. There was color returning to his cheeks, a thin pink color like the inside of a shell. His small fist had found her finger and had not let it go. The town of Lander appeared just as the sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks. It was a rougher town than Adelaide had imagined. 2 streets of frame buildings, a church with a bell that did not look as though it had ever been new, a livery and a smith in a general store, and 1 hotel. The hotel was called the Sweetwater. The stagecoach pulled up in front of it in a great rolling cloud of dust, and the driver climbed down off the box and began to call out names for the passengers who were being met. Hank Mercer leaned across the coach. "Miss, the Calloways will be here. They're meeting us. They've been waiting all day like as not." Adelaide nodded. She could not speak. She gathered her small carpet bag with one hand and held the sleeping baby against her shoulder with the other. She let Hank Mercer help her down from the coach into the red-gold light of the western evening. There were 3 men standing on the boardwalk of the Sweetwater Hotel. 3 men in long dusters and broad hats who looked as though the mountains themselves had sent them down out of the high country to see what manner of small creature had arrived on the stage. Adelaide saw them before she had taken 2 steps, and her feet stopped moving without any instruction from her mind. They were tall. That was the first thing. They were the tallest men she had ever seen, and they were tall in the way that suggested every inch of them had been earned by lifting and walking and surviving. They were broad through the shoulders. Their hands, even at this distance, looked like the hands of men who knew what wood and rope and rifle barrels and the mouths of horses felt like. The middle one, the largest of the 3, wore a black hat pulled low across his eyes and a duster the color of an old saddle, and he was very still. The man to his left had hair the color of dark wheat and eyes that even from across the street caught the sunset light and threw it back like polished glass. The man to his right was the youngest, lean as a fence rail, with a softer mouth than his brother's, and a smile that was already starting at the corners as he saw the woman who had stepped down from the coach, holding a small bundle in a blanket. The middle man, the one in the black hat, took 1 step forward. Then he stopped. Adelaide could see even at this distance that he was looking at the bundle in her arms, not at her face. He was looking at it the way a starving man looks at bread through the window of a bakery. He was looking at it the way a drowning man looks at a rope. The youngest brother came across the street first. He moved easily, the way a man who has lived all his life on uneven ground learns to move, and he stopped 3 paces from Adelaide and took off his hat. "Miss Thornberry," Adelaide nodded. "My name is Ezekiel Calloway, ma'am. Folks call me Zeke. I'm the youngest of the three. Those are my brothers." He looked at her face very gently, and then his eyes dropped to the small bundle she carried, and his face did something complicated. "Ma'am, is that—" "This is Hank Mercer's passenger," Adelaide said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. Mr. Mercer was bringing the baby back to Lander after a journey. There was a difficulty on the road. The baby was very ill, Mr. Calloway. I helped to settle him. Zeke Calloway looked at her for a long second. Then he turned his head and called over his shoulder, "Silas, Toby, come here." The other two crossed the street. Up close, the middle brother was even larger than he had seemed, and his face beneath the black hat was the face of a man who had not slept properly in a very long time. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had been put there by sun and wind and grief, and the grief was the deepest mark of the three. His eyes, when they finally lifted from the bundle in Adelaide's arms to her face, were the color of dark amber held up to firelight, and they were the saddest eyes Adelaide Thornberry had ever seen on a living man. He did not speak. He held out his arms. Adelaide stepped forward and gave him his son. Silas Calloway took the small bundle the way a man takes a thing he is afraid to break. He drew the blanket back with one work-hardened finger and looked down at the small face that had been hidden inside it, and Adelaide watched the entire careful structure of his composure come apart in front of her. He did not cry. A man like Silas Calloway, she would learn in the months ahead, did not cry where other people could see him. But his shoulders, which had been set as if to carry the whole sky, sagged once. His hand that was not holding the baby came up and pressed flat against his own mouth. He stood there for a long time in the red-gold light of the western sunset, and the only sound on the boardwalk was the small, soft breathing of his child against his chest. When he finally looked up at Adelaide, his eyes were dry. "Miss Thornberry," he said. His voice was deep and slow and worn at the edges like an old riverbed. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to pay." Adelaide opened her mouth and could find nothing to say. The brother with wheat-colored hair, the one called Toby, was watching her with an expression that was harder to read. His eyes, that whiskey gold color, did not leave her face. He had not smiled. He had not said anything at all. He looked, Adelaide thought, like a man who did not want her there. She felt the blood come up in her cheeks. "Mr. Calloway," she said to Silas. She had to clear her throat. "I think there has been a misunderstanding between us. I was given to understand by a letter that you were expecting me. I came west on the strength of that letter. I did not know about the child." Silas Calloway raised his head and looked at her, and the look was a patient question that he could not yet ask out loud. It was Zeke who answered. Zeke, who looked at the boards under his boots and then up at his oldest brother and said very quietly, "See, we need to talk inside." The Sweetwater Hotel had a small parlor off the main room with 2 horsehair chairs and a window that looked out at the street. Zeke ordered coffee from the woman who ran the place and asked for a private hour. Toby Calloway stayed in the hall outside the door with his arms folded and his mouth set in a hard straight line. Silas sat down in one of the horsehair chairs with his son in his arms and did not put him down. Adelaide sat in the other chair. She had not been able to make herself let go of her carpet bag yet. It sat in her lap like a small, frightened animal. Zeke remained standing. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "See, there is something I have got to tell you. I should have told you weeks ago. I knew that even when I was doing it, and I did it anyway, and now you are going to want to throw me out of this room, and I will not blame you." Silas did not look up from his son's face. "Tell me, Zeke." Zeke drew a long breath. "After Lily died." He stopped and started again. "After Lily died, you would not eat. You would not speak. You sat by the cradle for 3 days, and you would not look at the boy. Toby and I were scared, Si. We were scared we were going to value you the same way we lost her. And then the wet nurse in town started to fail, and the boy was getting thinner, and I was up at night looking at him and thinking this child is going to die before he is 2 months old. and his father is going to duck behind him, and I am going to be the only Calloway left to bury them both." Silas did not move. Zeke's voice grew unsteady. "So I wrote a letter. I wrote a letter to a paper in Boston, and I placed an advertisement, and I signed your name to it. Cy, I am sorry. I am so sorry. I told myself 100 lies about why it was the right thing. I told myself I would tell you the moment I got an answer back. I told myself I would explain it to you and you would understand. But then the answer came and it was from her, and her handwriting was so careful and the words she had written were so honest, and I could not bring myself to do anything but write back. I wrote back to her in your name. I sent her the money for the ticket. I told her you would be waiting at the Sweetwater Hotel in Lander on the 8th of August. And then the 8th of August came and we got on our horses to come to town, and you came with us because you thought we were coming to fetch the boy back from Hank. And the whole way down the mountain, I have been trying to find the words to tell you what I did, and I never found them. And now she is here, and the boy is here, and I cannot lie about it any longer." There was a silence in the small parlor that felt as though it might never end. Silas Calloway very slowly lifted his head and looked at his youngest brother. "You wrote to a woman in my name." "Yes, see. You promised her my home." "Yes, Si. You let her cross a country on the strength of a promise you had no right to make." Zeke's eyes had gone wet. "Yes, see, I did." For a long, terrible moment, Adelaide thought Silas Calloway was going to stand up and strike his brother, and she did not know whether she would have the courage to step between them. But Silas did not stand up. He looked down at his son's face. He looked at the small mouth that was sleeping the sleep of a child who had been pulled back from the far country at the last possible hour. He looked at Adelaide Thornberry, who was still sitting in her dusty navy blue traveling dress, with her carpet bag on her lap, watching him with eyes the color of cornflowers in summer, and a face that was trying very hard not to show how frightened she was. He spoke finally to her, not to Zeke. "Miss Thornberry, I am not the man who wrote those letters to you. The hand was my brother's. The promises were my brother's. I want you to know that before anything else is said in this room, I would not deceive a woman about a thing like that. Not for any reason in the world." Adelaide nodded. She could not yet trust her voice. "I do not know what to do," Silas said. "I would like a moment to think. Will you grant me that? Yes, Mr. Calloway." He stood up very carefully with his sleeping son in his arms. He carried the boy to the window and stood there with his back to the room, looking out at the dust and the long shadows, and he did not move for a long time. When he turned around, his face had set into something Adelaide could not read. "Miss Thornberry, I will not lie to you, and I will not let my brother's wrong stand. The honest course is to put you back on the next coach east with enough money to start again wherever you would like to start. I will give you that. I will give it to you tonight. You owe me nothing. You owe my brother nothing. The fault here is ours." Adelaide felt the floor of the small parlor tilt under her chair. She had known this was coming. She had known it in her bones from the moment Hank Mercer had said the name Silas Calloway on the road. But knowing a thing is coming and hearing it spoken out loud, it are different things, and she found for one cold moment that her throat would not work. Then she heard her own voice say very quietly, "Mr. Calloway, may I say something before you decide?" Silas inclined his head. Adelaide set her carpet bag down on the floor for the first time since she had come into the parlor. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the small, sleeping bundle in his arms. "That child has no name yet." Silas's jaw moved once, but he did not speak. "I noticed it on the boardwalk when you took him from me. A father who has named his son says the name when he holds him. You did not say a name. Hank Mercer told me you have not been able to say one since his mother died. I am sorry, Mr. Calloway. I am truly and deeply sorry for your loss. I can see what it has done to you, and I would not add to it for the world." Silas's eyes had gone very bright. "But that child almost died on that coach today. He had hours left, maybe less. I have spent 8 years of my life inside the nursery of an orphanage in Boston, and I have held more babies than most women hold in 3 lifetimes. And I am telling you the truth when I tell you that. There is no wet nurse in Lander now. There is winter coming in 3 months. You and your brothers cannot give that boy what he needs alone. I do not say that to wound you. I say it because it is true and because the truth has to be said before anything else. Silas was looking at her now as though seeing her for the first time. Adelaide drew a slow breath. I will not ask you to marry me, Mr. Calloway. I am not asking that. Your brother had no right to promise it, and I have no right to claim it. But I am asking you to let me come up the mountain with you. Let me care for that boy. Let me give him what I know how to give. One season, one winter, if you will allow it. When the road opens again in the spring, if you wish me gone, I will go without one word of complaint, and you will owe me nothing for it. I do not need wages. I need a roof and a place at your table, and the chance to keep this child alive. That is all I am asking for, Mr. Calloway. That is the whole of it. She stopped. She had not known she was going to say any of that until she had said it. Her hands in her lap were trembling, and she pressed them flat against her dress to make them stop. Silas Calloway stood at the window with his son in his arms and looked at her. The sunset light was coming in over his shoulder, and it caught the small wisps of hair at the baby's temple and made them shine. He did not speak for what felt like a very long time. Then he said in a voice that had gone rough, "You will not survive a winter in those mountains, Miss Thornberry." "Then let me try, Mr. Calloway. I have survived worse than a winter." Silas looked down at his son. He looked at the small face that had color in it again, because of the woman sitting across the parlor from him. He looked at the small fist that had found a fold of his coat and closed around it. "My name is Silas," he said quietly. "If you are coming up the mountain with us, you will not call me Mr. Calloway." The mountain does not have any patience for that kind of distance between people who are sharing a roof. Adelaide felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. "Then you will call me Adelaide." Silas nodded, once, slowly. "There is one thing more," he said. "I want you to hear it from me now before we go a foot further. The Calloways keep their word. I do not make promises I cannot keep, and I do not break the ones I make. If you come up that mountain with us, you will be safe under my roof. You will have your own room. You will be treated as a sister of the house. No man under that roof will trouble you. You have my word on that, and my word is not a small thing." "I believe you, Silas." He nodded again. Then he looked at his youngest brother, who was still standing by the door with his hat in his hands. "Zeke." "Yes, Si." "I am not done with you about this. We will speak about it for a long time, you and me, but not in front of her and not in front of the boy. Tonight you will go and find Toby and tell him what is happening, and the three of us will see that Miss Thornberry has a clean room at this hotel and supper and anything else she needs. In the morning we ride up the mountain, all four of us, all five of us." Zeke swallowed and nodded and turned to go, and then he stopped at the door and looked back. "See, the boy still needs a name." Silas stood very still. He looked at Adelaide. Then he looked down at the small face and the crook of his arm. Then he looked out the window at the high blue ridges of the Wind River Range turning purple and gold in the dying light. "Lily wanted to name him Jonah," he said quietly. "She said Jonah was the name of a man who came back from the place no one comes back from. She said she wanted a son who could come back from anything." I could not say the name out loud. After she died, I could not say it. It felt like saying it would make it real that she was not here to say it with me. He drew a long, unsteady breath. "His name is Jonah Calloway. I should have said it weeks ago. I am saying it now." Adelaide felt the tears come up into her eyes, hot and sudden, and she did not try to stop them. They ran down her cheeks, and she let them. The small bundle in Silas Calloway's arms slept on, and his small chest rose and fell beneath the blanket, and his small fist held tight to his father's coat, and his name at last had been spoken aloud in the room where he was. Outside the window of the Sweetwater Hotel, the last light of the August sun slid down behind the peaks of the Wind River Mountains, and the first stars came out one by one over the rooftops of Lander, Wyoming, in the high country of the territory that was not yet a state. And Adelaide Thornberry, 22 years old, an orphan from Boston with no family in the world, and $40 to her name in a folded letter in her lap that had been written by a brother she had not yet learned to forgive, sat in the small parlor of a frontier hotel and looked at the man who would carry her up a mountain in the morning, and at the child she had pulled back from the edge of the dark, and she understood with a clarity that frightened her that the door behind her was closed forever, and that whatever waited for her up that mountain in the morning was going to be the rest of her life. She did not know yet what shape that life would take. She did not know yet that there was a man named Rance Mosley riding the back trails out of Denver with 3 hard men at his back and 4 years of false grievance in his belly, and that Mosley had been hunting Ezekiel Calloway since the winter of '78, and that within the month Mosley would learn where the Calloway brothers had gone to ground, and that the long road from Denver to Bear Hollow was already beginning to roll under his horse's hooves, whether anyone in this small parlor knew it or not. She did not know yet that there was a brother named Tobias standing out in the hallway of the Sweetwater Hotel, with his arms folded and his mouth hard, and that Tobias had buried a girl named Cordelia Bramwell 4 winters ago and had sworn to himself across her grave that he would never again let any soft thing through the gate of his heart, and that the moment he had seen Adelaide Thornberry step down from the coach with a dying child in her arms, something in the old wall around him had cracked and was going to keep cracking whether he willed it or not. She did not know yet that there was a lawyer in Philadelphia named Phineas Ashcroft sitting at this very moment behind a great oak desk with a will in front of him and her name written into it in brown ink, and that an uncle she had never met had left her enough money to remake the world. She did not know any of those things. She knew only that the small boy in his father's arms was breathing, and that his name was Jonah, and that she had promised him on the road that she would sort the rest of it out. She intended to keep her promise. Outside the parlor window, somewhere in the deep blue evening above Lander, an owl called once across the rooftops, and the sound was thin and clear and very far away like the first note of a song that had not yet been sung. They left Lander before sunrise. The morning came up cold over the foothills, the way August mornings come up cold in the high country, with a thin blue mist lying along the Popo Ag River and the smell of pine smoke drifting from the chimneys of the still sleeping town. Adelaide Thornberry stood on the boardwalk of the Sweetwater Hotel with her carpet bag at her feet and her mother's silver cameo pinned again at her throat, and she watched the 3 Calloway brothers load the wagon by lantern light. They worked without talking. They worked the way men work who have done a thing together 1,000 times each, knowing where the other's hands would be before those hands arrived. Silas Calloway lifted her small trunk into the wagon bed as though it weighed nothing. He had not spoken 20 words to her since the parlor of the hotel the night before, but he had paid for her room and her supper, and he had sent a clean dress up to her by way of the woman who ran the place. The dress folded carefully and smelling faintly of cedar, and there had been no note attached to it because Silas Calloway was not the kind of man who put words on paper unless he had to. Adelaide had understood the dress without a note. The dress had said, "You are coming with us." Tobias Calloway had not said anything at all. He had ridden out of Lander the night before to check on a trap line he had set in the hills above town the way he always did, when a piece of hard news in a closed room made him need open country under his horse. And he had ridden back in from somewhere in the dark before dawn, his horse blowing steam, his duster heavy with dew, and he had nodded to Adelaide once across the wagon and turned to help his brothers with the harness. Adelaide had felt his eyes on her twice since then, and both times when she had looked up, he had been looking at something else. It was Ezekiel who came to her now. Ezekiel Calloway the youngest, the one who had written the letter, the one who had not been able to look at his oldest brother all evening. He stopped a careful pace away from her and turned his hat in his hands. "Miss Thornberry, Adelaide, I would like to say a thing to you before we start up the road." "Yes, Mr. Calloway." "Zeke, please." Yes, Zeke. He drew in a breath. He was a tall man, but he made himself small, now the way a tall man does when he is asking forgiveness from a person who has every right to refuse it. What I did was wrong. I want you to know that I know it. I sat up most of the night thinking about it, and I could not find a single way to make it look right in my own head. I used your loneliness against you. I used a name that was not mine to use. I dressed up my own fear of losing my brother in the shape of a kindness to a stranger, and I called it good. It was not good. It was the most selfish thing I have ever done in my life. And I am sorry, Adelaide. I am sorrier than I know how to say. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. The lantern light made the planes of his young face very soft. He was 28 years old, and he looked in that moment like a boy. Zeke, may I tell you something? Yes, ma'am. I held your nephew yesterday on a coach for 4 hours, and there was a part of those 4 hours when I thought he was going to die in my arms. And I have been thinking all night about what would have happened to that child if I had not been on that coach. And I cannot get the answer out of my head. The answer is that he would not be in his father's arms this morning. The answer is that you would be digging a small grave today instead of harnessing a wagon. Zeke's eyes filled. So I'm not going to tell you that what you did was right. It was not right. Your brother is going to spend a long time being angry with you about it, and he should. But I am going to tell you that I am here, and Jonah is alive, and the road that brought me here was the road you set me on. Whatever else is true about your letter, that is also true. I am not going to forget the wrong of it, but I am not going to forget the rest of it either. Zeke could not speak. He nodded once hard and turned his face away, and then he turned back and said in a voice that was not quite steady, "Welcome to the family, Adelaide Thornberry, for as long as you choose to stay." Then he picked up her carpet bag and carried it to the wagon. Silas came around from the front of the team. He had Jonah wrapped in a clean wool blanket against his chest, the small body sheltered inside the curve of his huge arm. He looked at Adelaide and at the wagon seat and at the road that climbed away into the foothills. "You will ride up front with me," he said. "The wagon seat is harder than the bench inside, but the air is better, and the boy will be quieter where he can hear my voice and yours. Toby and Zeke will ride flanking. 2 days to Bear Hollow if the weather holds. We will camp tonight at a place I know, and we will be home by sundown tomorrow." Home, Adelaide thought. He had said it very simply, the way a man says any other word. Home. She let him hand her up onto the wagon seat. His hand was warm and rough and steady, and it let go of hers the moment her boots were on the boards. He climbed up beside her, with the baby still cradled against him, and gathered the reins in one hand and made a small sound in his throat to the team. The wagon lurched forward into the cold blue morning, and the long road north out of Lander began to roll under the wheels. They climbed all that first day. The country opened in front of them and then folded around them the way mountain country does. They left the cottonwoods of the river bottom behind by mid-morning, and the road climbed in switchbacks through grasslands scattered with sage and then up into the first of the pine forest. The air thinned by inches as the day wore on. The sky overhead was the deep, hard blue of high country sky, and the only clouds were small, flat ones that moved very fast across it, the way clouds move when they are higher up than you are used to clouds being. Adelaide had never in her life seen country like this. She had grown up inside walls, the orphanage, the corridors, the nursery, the small back garden with the brick walls. Boston had been a city of brick and stone and gray water, and the only sky she had ever known had been a sky cut up into squares between rooftops. Now the sky was the whole world above her, and the mountains rose to the west of the road in a wall of blue and white that did not look as though human beings had any business being near it. It frightened her. It also did something else to her, something she did not have a word for yet. Silas drove the wagon with the patience of a man who had driven it 1,000 times. He did not speak much. When he did speak, it was to point at a thing he thought she should see. A bull elk standing motionless in a clearing, watching them pass. A red-tailed hawk turning slow circles against the blue. a place in the road where a creek had washed out the gravel 2 springs ago, and his brothers and he had spent a whole day rebuilding the bank with stones. Each time he spoke, his voice was low and steady and a little tired, and Jonah, asleep against his chest, never once stirred. "You hold him for a stretch," Silas said in the middle of the afternoon. "My arm is going wooden. I am ashamed to say it." "You should not be ashamed of holding him so long that your arm goes wooden, Silas. That is what arms are for." He glanced at her then. It was the first time all day he had looked at her properly. Something at the corner of his mouth almost moved. "Take him." She took the small, warm bundle from him and settled the baby into the crook of her own arm. Jonah made a small, contented sound in his sleep and pressed his face into the wool of her dress. Silas watched it happen for 1 second longer than he needed to, and then he turned his eyes back to the road. They camped that night in a stand of lodgepole pine beside a creek that ran cold and fast over white stones. Toby built the fire. Zeke staked the horses. Silas unloaded the wagon and laid out a bedroll for Adelaide near the fire, and his own bedroll on the far side of it, with the brothers too on the other side, so that the fire stood between her and the men. He did it without asking her permission and without explaining himself, and Adelaide understood and did not say anything. She fed Jonah by firelight with goat milk from a stoppered jug Silas had brought in the wagon, and the baby drank with the slow, steady greed of an infant who has remembered finally that drinking is what mouths are for. The brothers ate beans and salt pork and hard biscuits and drank coffee out of tin cups. The fire popped. The horses moved softly on their tethers. Above the taste of the pines, the stars came out by the 1,000 more stars than Adelaide had ever seen in her life, and she sat with the baby in her arms and looked up at them and could not speak. It was Toby who broke the silence. He had not said one word to her all day. He had ridden flank on the right side of the wagon for 9 straight hours, the rifle resting across the pommel of his saddle, his eyes on the trees. Now he was sitting on the far side of the fire with his coffee in his hands, and when he finally spoke, he spoke without looking at her. "You did a thing on that coach yesterday, Miss Thornberry." Adelaide waited. "I have known a few women in my time who have raised babies. I have known 1 or 2 who could have done what Hank Mercer described to me last night. But I have not known any who would have done it for a child that was not theirs in front of strangers, with their hands shaking the whole time the way Hank says yours were shaking. I was not afraid for myself, Mr. Calloway." "Toby, I was not afraid for myself, Toby. I was only afraid I would be too late." Toby's eyes lifted then finally and met hers across the fire. They were the color of whiskey held up to a window, and they were not unkind, but they were guarded the way an animal that has been hurt is guarded. "That is what I am trying to say to you. You are not afraid for yourself. I have not met many people in this life who can put themselves down all the way like that for a stranger. I do not understand it yet. I am not a man who trusts a thing he does not understand. But I wanted you to know that I saw it, and I am thinking about it, and I will not make up my mind about you until I have thought about it some more." It was Adelaide realized the most generous thing Tobias Calloway knew how to say to a stranger. "Thank you, Toby." He nodded once and looked back into the fire. Across the flames, Silas was watching the exchange with his eyes half closed, and Adelaide could not have said what was behind that look, but she felt the warmth of it on her face. The second day was harder than the first. The road climbed more steeply now, and twice they had to stop and put their shoulders to the back of the wagon to get it through a rough place. Adelaide held the baby and the reins both while the brothers pushed, and she discovered that she could do it, and she discovered that the discovering of it made her stand up straighter on the wagon seat. By mid-afternoon, they had crested a long ridge, and the country fell away in front of them into a wide green valley cradled between 2 arms of the mountains, and a small, bright thread of creek ran through the bottom of it, and on a low rise above the creek stood a long log house with a stone chimney and a barn behind it, and corrals and a smokehouse and a chicken coop and the small straight lines of a kitchen garden. Silas pulled the team to a stop on the ridge. He did not say anything for a long moment. He just looked down at the valley, Then he said, Adelaide, that is Bear Hollow. That is my home. If you are willing, that is your home now, too, for as long as you choose it. Adelaide looked down into the valley with the small log house in it and the smoke rising from the chimney, where Hank Mercer had ridden ahead the day before to lay a fire and warm the place for them, and the long shadows of the late afternoon falling across the meadow. She felt something very strange happen inside her chest. She felt the loosening of a knot she had not known. She had been carrying a knot she had been carrying for longer than she had memory of carrying it, perhaps for the whole 22 years of her life. She did not cramp on. She only sat very still on the wagon seat with the small breathing weight of Jonah Calloway against her heart. And she looked and she looked and she looked. It is beautiful, Silas. It is the only thing I have ever made that is worth a damn. He clucked to the team and the wagon began the slow descent into Bear Hollow. The first week in the house went by in a blur of small, ordinary things that felt to Adelaide like miracles. Silas had given her the largest of the bedrooms upstairs. It had been the room he and Lily had prepared for the baby, and Adelaide understood, without being told, that he had emptied it of every reminder of Lily before her arrival. The walls were clean, the bedstead was simple pine. There was a hand-carved cradle beside the bed, and when Adelaide ran her fingers over the rails of it, she could feel the marks of Silas's knife, where he had worked the wood himself, and her throat closed up, and she had to sit down on the edge of the bed and breathe for a moment. The kitchen was a wide room with a great cast-iron stove and a long pine table and a window that looked east toward the mountains. The pantry was deeper than she had expected. The sitting room had a stone fireplace, big enough to roast a deer in, and there was, of all impossible things, a small bookshelf in the corner with perhaps 50 volumes on it. Adelaide had not expected books. She drifted to the shelf on her second day in the house and ran her fingers over the spines, and she found Dickens there, and Sir Walter Scott, and a book of Tennyson, and a worn copy of the King James Bible, and a slim volume of Robert Burns. She turned to find Zeke watching her from the doorway. They were our mother's, Zeke said quietly. She brought them west in a trunk in 1858 when she came out from Pennsylvania to marry our father. She read aloud from them to us every winter night until the night she died. Toby and I can both read because of those books. Cy reads slower than us because he was older and he was already out in the fields when she was teaching us, but he reads them too. He just does not let anyone catch him at it. Adelaide turned the small volume of Burns over in her hands. She thought about a woman she had never met, a woman who had carried 50 books west in a trunk on a wagon train, a woman who had read aloud to her 3 sons in the long winter nights, a woman who had loved this house enough to leave her sons here when she died. She felt suddenly and without warning the presence of those women in the room with her. She set the Burns back on the shelf with a care that was almost reverence. Thank you, Zeke. For what, Adelaide? For telling me about your mother. I would like to read aloud from those books this winter by the fire, if you and your brothers would not mind it. Zeke's eyes went bright. He turned away quickly so that she would not see it. I would like that very much, Adelaide. So would Cy. He will not say so, but he would. The brothers fell into the shape of themselves around her in those first weeks, and Adelaide began to learn them. Silas was the steady one, and he was the silent one, and he was the one who carried the whole house on his back without ever once acting as though he was carrying anything at all. He rose before light. He worked with the cattle and the horses and the long fence lines all day, and when he came in at sundown, his hands were always raw, and his shoulders were always set against my son, a pain Adelaide could see and could not name. He stopped at Jonah's cradle every single night before he climbed the stairs to his own room. He never knew that Adelaide knew this. She heard the slow, heavy boots in the hallway and the small pause of breath at the cradle and the mordant silent moment in which his great work, hardened hand, would very gently brush his son's cheek. Then the boots would move on. He never spoke a word during those moments. He did not need to. Adelaide lay in her bed on the other side of the wall and listened to her own heart climb up into her throat every single time. Toby was the wild one, and Adelaide would learn slowly what that meant. He was gone from the house for long stretches up into the high country with his rifle and his traps, and when he came back smelling of pine smoke and gunpowder in the cold stones of the creeks he had crossed. He brought venison. He brought elk. Once he brought a wild turkey that he laid on the kitchen table without a word and walked back out to the barn before Adelaide could thank him. He did not eat at the table for the first 6 days. He took his plate to the porch. On the seventh evening, he came in and sat down at the moss pine table without looking at anybody. And Silas did not remark on it, and Zeke did not remark on it, and Adelaide passed him the bowl of beans without remarking on it either. And that was how Tobias Calloway came inside. Zeke was the quiet one, and Adelaide learned that quiet did not mean what she had thought it meant. Zeke was the brother who was the easiest with words and the easiest with feelings, but he was quiet in his hands. He moved softly. He set a cup down on a table without a sound. He could come into a room behind you without your knowing it, not because he was sneaking, but because his body had taught itself somewhere along the way to take up no more space in the world than it absolutely needed. He played a battered harmonica in the evenings. He read aloud to Adelaide from the Tennyson on the second Sunday she was in the house, and his voice for poetry was the most surprising thing she had heard in a long time, low and careful and perfectly true to the rhythm of the lines. And when he finished the poem, she had to wipe her eyes with the back of her wrist before he saw. And in the middle of those three men, in the middle of the great log house in Bear Hollow, in the middle of the green valley, between the two arms of the Wind River Mountains, the small thing that mattered most of all kept on growing. Jonah Calloway was gaining weight. Adelaide had begun the careful work of feeding him on the goat's milk. Silas had ridden out to a neighboring ranch to fetch, and she had built her schedule around the baby, the way she had built her schedule around all the babies of her old life, with a nurseryman's instinct for what came next. Every 2 hours by day, every 3 by night, warm cloth, clean cradle, dry blanket, the small, slow business of bringing a child back into himself. And the child, after his first week in the house, had a different color in his face. After his second week, his eyes were tracking the firelight. After his third week, he laughed for the first time in his short life, a small, startled sound that came out of him while Zeke was making a face over the cradle, and all three Calloway brothers froze in place at the sound of it as though God had spoken in the room. Silas had been across the kitchen with his coffee. He set the cup down very slowly on the table. He came across the room, he stood at the cradle, and he looked down at his son, and his face did the thing it had done on the boardwalk in Lander that first evening, the thing where the careful structure of his composure came apart for a half second and then rebuilt itself. "Was that him?" Silas asked. "That was him, sigh," Zeke said. "That was your son laughing." Silas did not answer. He bent over the cradle and picked his son up, and he held him at arm's length and looked into his face in the small face. After a moment broke into the second laugh. Jonah Calloway had ever laughed in his life, a fat, startled gurgle of a laugh, the laugh of a baby who had decided the world was worth staying in. Silas pulled the boy in against his chest and held him there with both hands, and his shoulders went down. For the first time since Adelaide had met him, all the way down the long-held weight of grief, sliding off them onto the kitchen floor. He did not say anything, but that night after he had stopped at the cradle and brushed his son's cheek with one finger, as he always did, he did not move on. He stood there in the hallway in the dark for a long time. Adelaide could hear him breathing on the other side of the wall, and then she heard him say very softly in a voice she had not heard him use before, the voice a man uses when he is alone with a thing he loves, and he does not yet trust himself to say it where anybody can hear. "Hello, son." That was all. Just those 2 words in the dark. Adelaide pressed her face into her pillow and wept for joy without making a single sound. The first cold weather came in the 3rd week of September. It came down out of the high country overnight, a wind out of the northwest that had teeth in it, and Adelaide woke to find the kitchen window glazed with frost on the inside. She had gone out before breakfast to bring in an armload of firewood from the woodpile by the back door, and the porch boards had been slick with the first hard freeze of the year, and her foot had gone out from under her on the second step. She did not fall far. She did not fall hard. But the firewood had scattered and she had landed badly on her wrist, and she was sitting on the coal boards trying to gather the wood back into her arms when a hand came down on her shoulder. It was Tobias. He had ridden in from a 3-day trap line at first light. She had not even heard his horse. He was looking down at her now with his whiskey eyes and a face she could not read, and he reached down and took the firewood out of her hands and set it carefully on the porch. And then he reached down again and lifted her bodily to her feet as though she weighed less than the wood. "You ought not to be out here in this weather, Adelaide." "I needed firewood." "I will bring the firewood." "You will go inside." "Toby, inside, please." He said the please very softly. It was the first time she had ever heard him say the word. She went inside. He followed a few minutes later with an armload of split logs that would have been more than she could have lifted. He set them in the box by the stove. He did not leave. He stood with his back to the stove, warming his hands, looking at the floorboards, and Adelaide understood that he was working up to something, and she did not push him. "Adelaide?" "Yes, Toby. I owe you an apology, a bigger one than I have given." "You do not owe me anything, Toby." "I do. I have been holding myself away from you since you got here, and you have noticed, and I have been telling myself it was because I did not trust you, and that was a lie I told myself. I want to tell you the truth of it now, if you will let me." Adelaide sat down at the kitchen table. The baby was asleep in the cradle in the corner. The fire popped softly in the stove. Outside, the first hard wind of the season was bending the tops of the pines. "I am listening, Toby." He did not sit. He stayed by the stove, his big hands turned out toward the heat, his eyes on the floor. "There was a girl, 4 winters ago. Her name was Cordelia Bramwell. Her people came out of Scotland by way of the mining camps in Pennsylvania, and her father ran sheep in the next valley over from this one, and she had hair the color of dark copper, and she laughed like nobody I have ever known before or since. We were going to be married in the spring of '79. I was going to build a small house up the slope from this one, and she was going to be my wife in it, and we were going to raise children inside the same valley as my brothers, and that was going to be my life." Adelaide did not move. "In February of that year, the typhus came through the valleys. It came through fast. It came through the Bramwell place in 3 days, and I was not there, Adelaide. I was up in the high country running a trap line. I had told Della the week before that I would be gone 5 days. I had told her I would bring her back the money to buy a wedding dress out of a Cheyenne catalog. That was the whole reason I went up. For the dress money, for a piece of cloth she was going to wear for one day in front of a preacher." His voice was very steady. The steadiness of it was harder to listen to than tears would have been. "I came down off the mountain on the 5th day the way I had told her I would. I rode up to the Bramwell place at sundown. The lamps were lit in the front room. I knew before I got off my horse. I do not know how a man knows a thing like that, but I knew. Her father met me at the door. He was a hard man, old Bramwell. He was not a man who cried. He was crying when he opened the door to me. He took me upstairs to her room. She was still alive. She lived for another 18 hours. I sat in that chair next to her bed for every one of those 18 hours, and I held her hand. And toward the end, she was clear for a little while, and she looked at me and she said, 'You came, Toby. You came back.' And I told her I was sorry I had ever left. And she said, 'You came back, and that is what counts.' And then she was gone." He stopped. He did not look up from the floor. "I dug her grave myself, Adelaide. Her father was too sick by then to lift a shovel. I dug it in the frozen ground with a pickaxe, and I lined it with cedar boughs, because she had loved the smell of cedar, and I did not have flowers in February. I have not spoken her name out loud to anybody in 4 years. Not to Cy, not to Zeke. I am speaking it now to you because of what happened on that porch this morning." He looked up. "When I saw you on those boards out there with your wrists twisted under you and the firewood scattered around you and your face the color of paper, I had a thing happen inside me that I have not let happen in 4 years. I had a thing happen that felt like the world was going to come open under my feet again. I could not breathe for a second. I stood at the kitchen door and I could not move. And then I came out and I picked you up off the porch and you weighed nothing in my hands and I knew. Knew what, Toby? I knew that I had been keeping myself away from you because you were already in. You came in the day you stepped down off that coach with my nephew in your arms. You came in and I felt it, and I tried to keep you out by not looking at you and not speaking to you and not eating at the table with you, and none of it worked. None of it was ever going to work. He stopped. He drew a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was very careful. I am not asking you for anything, Adelaide. I want you to hear that part very clearly. I am not asking. I am telling you because I owe you the truth. I am telling you that I see you. I am telling you that I have seen you since the first minute. And I am telling you that whatever happens in this house, in the months ahead, whatever you decide and whoever you decide it with, I am on your side. I will be on your side until the day I am in the ground next to Della. That is all. That is the whole of it. Adelaide was very still at the kitchen table. She was looking at the big man by the stove with his head bowed and his hands turned out toward the heat, and she understood in a way that did not need words that Tobias Calloway had just laid down the heaviest thing he had carried in 4 years on the floor of her kitchen. She stood up. She crossed the kitchen. She did not touch him because she understood that touch would break him in half. She stopped at his shoulder and she said very softly, Toby, thank you for telling me about Della. She sounds like a fine woman. I would have liked to know her. You would have Adelaide. She would have liked you. She would have liked you a lot. Then I am going to read about her tonight in the Burns book by the fire, and I am going to think about her, and I am going to let her be in this house with us, the way Lily is in this house with us, the way your mother is. There is room in this house for everyone who has loved it. Tobias Calloway did not answer. He could not. He stood very still with his hands turned out toward the stove, and after a long moment he reached up with the back of his wrist and wiped his face. Then he said in a voice that was almost steady, Winter is coming, Adelaide. Yes, Toby. It is going to be a hard one. I can feel it in my bones. The geese went south 2 weeks early this year, and the elk are already down off the high country. We are in for a long one. Then we will face it together. Yes, ma'am, we will. He nodded once and walked out of the kitchen. Adelaide stood alone in the warm room with the cradle in the corner and the fire popping in the stove, and she thought the mountain has begun to teach me its names one by one. Lily, Della, Sarah Calloway, and now behind their names somewhere very faintly like a fourth note added to a chord, her own name. Adelaide. The hard rider came in 3 days later. It was the last week of September, and the second storm of the season was bearing down out of the northwest, and Adelaide was peeling potatoes at the kitchen table when she heard the horse on the road. It was not Toby's horse. She knew Toby's horse by now. It was not Hank Mercer's mule. It was a strange horse moving fast in the cold air, and when she went to the window, she saw a man in a long, dark coat coming down the road from the ridge above the house at a hard trot. And she saw Silas straighten up from the corral fence with his hand on the rifle that always lived within reach of his right hand when he was outside. The rider came up to the porch and pulled his horse to a stop and got down stiffly. He was perhaps 50 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of careful face that men in certain offices grow over the years. He pulled off his hat as he came up the steps. Silas met him at the porch with his rifle held loose across his forearm. The two men spoke for a minute in the cold, and then Silas turned and called over his shoulder for Zeke to come in from the barn. Zeke came across the yard at a run. Adelaide watched from the kitchen window with the paring knife forgotten in her hand. She watched Zeke stop on the porch in front of the stranger and go very still the way a man goes still when he hears a name from a part of his life he has been trying to bury. She watched the stranger take a folded paper out of an inside pocket and hand it across. She watched Zeke's face change. Then Silas turned and looked toward the kitchen window, and his eyes found her through the glass, and he gave her a small nod, and she understood that she was being asked to come out. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and went out onto the porch. "Adelaide," Silas said, "this is Marshal Augustus Holloway. He has come up from Denver. He has a thing to say to all of us. I would like you to hear it inside where it is warm." They went inside. Marshal Holloway took off his coat at the door and laid it across the bench. He sat down at the kitchen table with a small, grateful sound, the sound a man makes when he has been in a saddle for longer than his body wants to admit. Adelaide poured him coffee. Toby came in from the barn a moment later with snow already on the shoulders of his duster, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the marshal and at his oldest brother and at his youngest brother and did not say a word. Marshal Holloway put both his hands around the coffee cup and looked at Zeke. "Mr. Calloway, Ezekiel Calloway, I have been 4 years catching up to you. I have ridden a long road to find you, and most of that road I rode believing I was going to take you back to Denver in irons. I want you to know that before I say what I have come to say, I want you to know I am not a man who came to your door with a kindness in his pocket. I came with a warrant in my pocket. The warrant is in my saddlebag now, and I am going to burn it in your fireplace before I leave this house tonight with your permission." Zeke said nothing. His face had gone the color of the snow outside. The man who actually robbed the First Mercantile Bank in Denver in the autumn of '78 was caught last March in a saloon in El Paso. He was caught by a deputy who recognized him from a wanted poster, and he was brought back to Denver, and he made a full confession in the office of the chief prosecutor on the 2nd day of April this year. His confession named the 4 men who rode with him on that day. Your name was not on the list. He stated for the record that he had never met you, that he had only used your name when he was caught by a witness because your name was the first name that came into his head, and that you had nothing whatever to do with the robbery. The court vacated the warrant against you on the 8th of April. You are a free man, Mr. Calloway. You have been a free man for 5 months. The kitchen was so quiet Adelaide could hear the wind under the eaves. Zeke sat down very slowly in the chair across from the marshal. He put his face in his hands. "That is the kindness I have come to bring you, Mr. Calloway," Marshal Holloway said quietly. "Now I have to bring you the rest of it." He took another folded paper out of his inside pocket and laid it flat on the table between them. The man who actually committed the robbery had 3 regular associates in those years. 2 of them were caught last year and are serving time in the territorial prison in Cannon City. The 3rd was not caught. His name is Rance Mosley. He is 44 years old. He is from somewhere in eastern Tennessee originally, and he came west after the war, and he is the kind of man who keeps a ledger in his head of every wrong he believes the world has done. Him and the ledger never gets shorter. When his friend was arrested in El Paso in March, Mosley was in Denver. He learned about the arrest and the confession before any of us did. And he learned the way men like him learn things that his friend had named you in the original confession 4 years ago, and then unnamed you this spring. Mosley believed, or chose to believe, that you had turned his friend in to save your own neck. He started looking for you in April. Marshal Holloway looked across the table at Zeke, and then at Silas, and then at Adelaide. "He found you in August. I do not know how. A traveling preacher who had come through Bear Hollow in July spoke about the Calloway brothers in a saloon in Casper, and somebody in that saloon was being paid to listen for the name. Mosley left Casper on the 12th of September with 3 men. They are traveling slow because they are taking back roads, and they are buying provisions in cash at small stores so as not to leave a trail through the larger towns. They will be here by my best calculation within 7 days, maybe 10, not more than 10. Silas had been standing by the stove with his arms folded across his chest. He uncrossed his arms now and walked to the table and put both his great work hardened hands flat on the pine boards. "Marshal Holloway, why are you telling us this instead of arresting Mosley yourself?" "Because I cannot. Bear Hollow is 40 miles outside the boundary of my district. I have no jurisdiction here. I have ridden into your house tonight on the strength of a warrant I am about to burn, and a warning I have no authority to enforce. If I tried to take Mosley on Wyoming ground, I would be the one going back to Denver in irons. I have ridden up here to tell you what I know, And I have ridden up here to give your brother his good news, and that is the limit of what the law in Denver is permitted to do for you. From the minute I leave your porch, you and your brothers are on your own. I am sorry to bring you that. I would change it if I could. He drank off the rest of his coffee in one long swallow and stood up. There is one more thing. Mosley does not know about Miss Thornberry. He does not know about the child. He is coming for Ezekiel. He believes he is coming to a house with 3 men in it. If I were you, Mr. Calloway, I would use that. I would not let him see anything but what he expects to see until the moment he is inside the door of your house with no horse to run to. Silas nodded once. The marshal put on his coat. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at Zeke. Mr. Calloway, Ezekiel, I want you to hear me on one more thing. You have been a free man since April. Do not let the next 10 days take that from you. Whatever happens here, you did not earn what is coming. The man who is coming is bringing his own ledger, and his ledger has nothing to do with you. I know that does not help, but I wanted you to hear it from a man who has read the record. Zeke nodded without lifting his face from his hands. Marshal Holloway took the folded warrant out of his coat and walked to the fireplace and laid it on the embers, and the paper curled and blackened and was gone in less than a minute. And then he tipped his hat to Adelaide and walked out into the cold, and they heard his horse go up the road away from Bear Hollow. The 4 of them sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. It was Silas who broke the silence. Zeke, look at me. Zeke lifted his face. His eyes were dry and hot. You did not do this. You hear me. You did not do any of this. The man who is coming is not coming because of anything you did. He is coming because of what is broken in him, and there is nothing you could have been or done in this life that would have stopped him from coming once he set his mind on it. Do you understand me? Yes, so. Then we are going to fight him in this house. Together, the way our father fought the Cheyenne Raiders in this house in the spring of '63, when our mother was carrying me, the way the Callaways have always fought when a wrong man came up the road. We are going to make this house a hard place to enter and an even harder place to leave. Do you understand me, Zeke? Yes, sir. Toby. Yes, sir. Tomorrow morning at first light, you and I will go into Lander and buy 2 more boxes of cartridges and as much powder and shot as old Henriksen will sell us without asking what we want it for. Zeke will stay here with Adelaide in the ward and start the work on the cellar and the windows. Yes, see? Silas turned then finally to Adelaide. His amber eyes in the lamp light were very steady. Adelaide, I am going to ask you a thing now, and I am going to ask it once, and I am going to abide by your answer. There is a wagon in the barn. Tomorrow morning when Toby and I ride out, I can hitch that wagon and put your trunk and the boy in it and drive you down to Lander myself and put the 2 of you up at the Sweetwater Hotel with enough money to live on for as long as this takes. You and Jonah will be safe there. Mosley does not know about either of you. He has no reason to look for you. The marshal has said as much. I will come for you when this is done. If I do not come, Hank Mercer will come for you and he will see you to wherever you want to go. And the foundation of money I am about to set aside for the boy will go to you for his keep. That is one road. I want you to consider it before you answer. Adelaide looked at him. She looked at the cradle in the corner where Jonah was sleeping, the deep, oblivious sleep of a baby who did not yet know there was such a word in the world as Mosley. She looked at Zeke hunched at the table with his face slowly coming back to itself. She looked at Toby, whose whiskey eyes were on her and not on his coffee for the first time all night. She looked at Silas Calloway, who was offering her at the moment when he most needed her the chance to leave. She drew in a long, slow breath. Silas Calloway, you have offered me an honorable road, and I want you to know that I see it for what it is. But I am going to refuse it. I am going to refuse it for the same reason I came up this mountain in the first place. I came up this mountain because the boy in that cradle needed somebody who was not going to leave him, and the man at this table needed somebody who was not going to leave him, and a brother at this table needed somebody who was not going to write him out of the family for a wrong he never committed. I did not come up this mountain to be put back down the moment the road got hard. I am staying. I will go down to that cellar with Jonah when you tell me to, and I will stay there as long as you tell me to, and I will not be a fool about it, and I will not get in the way of any of your work. But I am staying. Silas looked at her for a long second. Then he nodded once very slowly, and Adelaide saw something in his face that she had not seen there before. It was the look of a man who has been given a thing he did not dare ask for and does not yet know how to receive. Then we will fight him here, Silas said. All four of us. The boy makes 5. The Calloways make 6 if you count my father and my mother in the wood of these walls, and I do count them. We have the numbers we need. The next 7 days were the longest week of Adelaide's life, and also in a strange way, she could not yet name one of the truest. Toby and Silas rode to Landis and came back the next afternoon with the cartridges and the powder and a length of new chain and 3 iron bars from the smith that Silas had ordered specifically for the inside of the front door. Zeke and Adelaide spent that first day measuring the cellar under the kitchen and clearing it of the old bins of seed potatoes and the broken plow handle that had been down there since before their mother died. Zeke laid down 2 clean wool blankets on the dirt floor and a tin lantern on a hook in the central beam, and a tin cup and a stopper jug of water, and a basket with bread and dried apples and a tin of the goat milk for Jonah, and a folded square of clean linen Adelaide could use to feed the baby in the dark by the tricks she had learned on the coach. Adelaide, Zeke said quietly when they were finished, if it comes to it, you will go down those stairs the moment Cy or Toby or I tell you. You will not stop to ask why. You will not stop to look back. You will take the bison and you will go and you will close the trap door behind you and you will not open it again until one of us calls your name. Do you understand, Bayavon? Yes, Zeke. If nobody calls your name by sundown of the day it happens, you will wait until full dark and then you will come up very quietly. There is a back door off the pantry that opens onto the kitchen garden. From there it is 2 miles up the slope to the Vandermeer place. Old Vandermeer is a hard man, but he is a good one and he will not turn you away with a child in your arms. Do you understand? Yes, Zeke. He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen on his young face before, an expression that was older than he was. Adelaide, I never had a sister. I want you to know that I think of you that way now. I want you to know that whatever happens in the next 10 days, if I do not get to say it again, I am glad my brother's stupid young brother wrote that letter to the Boston Herald. I am glad you came up that mountain. I am glad of it, whatever the cost. Adelaide could not answer. She just put her hand on his sleeve for a moment and squeezed it and turned away so he would not see her face. The 7th day of the week brought the first real snow of the season, 6 inches in the night, and the world was white and silent again outside the windows of the long log house at the head of Bear Hollow. Silas had not slept in his own bed for 3 nights running. He had been sleeping on the bench by the kitchen window, his rifle across his knees, his eyes on the road. Toby was up on the ridge above the house with his own rifle and a spyglass and a little blind he and Zeke had built out of cut pine boughs, and he came down only to eat and to warm himself by the stove for an hour at a time. Zeke moved between the barn and the cellar and the front room, checking and rechecking the iron bars on the door and the loaded rifles on the wall and the position of the wood box he had dragged across the front window to make a low-firing position. On the evening of the 7th day after supper, Silas asked Adelaide if she would step into the front room with him for a moment. She went. He had taken off his coat and his boots and was standing in his stocking feet by the fire, his back to the flames. The lamplight caught the gray in his temples that she had not noticed until then. His amber eyes in the warm light were the eyes of a man who had been counting the hours for 7 days and had not slept much in any of them. Adelaide, I have a thing for you. I have been carrying it in my coat pocket for 3 days, and I have not been able to give it to you because I did not want to give it to you in front of the brothers, and I did not want to give it to you in the kitchen where the boy could hear me, and I did not want to give it to you outside in the cold. I wanted to give it to you here in this room by this fire. He reached into his shirt pocket and drew out a small object wrapped in a fold of clean white cloth. He unfolded the cloth in the palm of his hand. Inside was a thin gold ring. The gold was old and a little dull from the years, and the band was simple with no stone, and a small flower had been carved into the metal of it, on one side the petals worn very faint by use. This was my mother's wedding ring. My father gave it to her on the morning she stepped down off the wagon train at Fort Laramie in 1858. She wore it for 22 years. The night before she died, she took it off her finger and put it in my hand, and she said, "Silas, you are the oldest, and you will know when." I never knew what she meant. I have known what she meant for about 10 days now. Adelaide could not breathe. "I am not asking you to wear it tonight, Adelaide. I am not asking you to wear it tomorrow. I am giving it to you now because I do not know what the next 10 days are going to bring into this house, and there are things a man should not put off saying out of pride or out of the wrong kind of caution, and I have already put this off too long. I want you to know what I would be asking you if I were the kind of man who asked for things in a time of peace. I want you to know that this house is your house, whatever happens. I want you to know that the boy in the kitchen is your boy, whatever happens. I want you to know that I love you, Adelaide Thornberry. I have loved you since the morning of the first snow. I should have said it then. I am saying it now because I cannot afford to wait any longer." He pressed the small gold ring into her hand and closed her fingers around it with both of his great hands. "Keep it. Whether you keep me or not, keep it for the mom if nothing else. Keep it as the piece of my mother that should never have stopped being in the world." Adelaide did the only thing she could think of to do. She stepped forward and put her face against his chest and let him close his arms around her. And she did not say anything for a long time because there were no words, and because the small gold ring was warm in her closed hand against his back, and because outside the window the snow was falling on the meadow that ran down to the creek, and because somewhere in the darkness beyond the snow, Rance Mosley and his 3 men were riding closer. She lifted her face at last, and she said very softly, "I am going to wear it tonight, Silas. I am going to wear it tonight and tomorrow and every day after that. And when this is over and the boy is sleeping in his cradle and Mosley is in the ground where he belongs, I am going to make you ask me properly in front of the brothers so that they can never let us hear the end of it. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Adelaide." "Good." She slid the ring onto the third finger of her left hand and let him see it on her there in the lamplight by the fire. They came at first light on the 9th day. Toby had seen them from the ridge an hour before sunrise. 4 riders moving slow up the road from the southeast. No lanterns. The breath of the horses smoking in the cold air. And he had come down off the ridge at a hard run and burst through the kitchen door and said one word. "Now." Adelaide was already dressed. She had not undressed for 2 nights. She picked Jonah up out of his cradle and wrapped him in the second wool blanket and carried him into the kitchen. Silas opened the trap door under the rag rug. Adelaide kissed Silas once on the mouth fast, and she put her hand against the cheek of Tobias and said his name once, and she squeezed Zeke's arm hard, and she went down the cellar stairs into the dark with the baby against her shoulder, and the trap door closed above her, and she heard the rag rug being pulled back into place, and then she heard the low, fast voices of the 3 men above her arranging themselves at the windows. She lit the tin lantern with shaking hands. She sat down on the wool blanket against the dirt wall with Jonah on her lap and her back to the cool earth, and she looked at the small face of the baby in the lantern light, and she said very softly, "You are going to be quiet for me, my love. You are going to be the quietest you have ever been in your short little life. You are going to let your mother listen for the men upstairs." She did not yet know that she had used the word mother out loud about herself for the first time. She would only realize it later. The first shot came perhaps 6 minutes after she sat down. It was a single shot, sharp and very loud through the floorboards above her head, and then there was a long second of silence, and then the world above her broke open. 2 rifles, 3 rifles, the flat, hard cracks of the Callaway weapons answering from the front room and the kitchen window. The duller, heavier sound of the stranger's guns from somewhere in the yard. A man shouting, another man shouting. The high splintering sound of glass going out of a window. A pause, another rifle shot. Another pause. Adelaide held Jonah tight against her chest and felt the baby's small heart beating against her own and prayed silently and steadily and without ceasing. She did not know how long it went on. It might have been 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. The shooting came in waves with long silences between and during the silences. She could hear very faintly the slow, heavy footsteps of one of the brothers crossing the floor above her. And once she heard Silas's voice very low, giving an order she could not quite make out. And once she heard Toby laugh a single, short, hard laugh. And the laugh frightened her more than the shots had, because it was the laugh of a man who had decided to be on the other side of fear. Then there was a silence longer than the others. Then there was a single final shot very close, almost directly above her head, the sound of it shaking the lantern on its hook. Then there was no sound at all. Adelaide held Jonah and waited. She did not move. She did not call out. Zeke had told her not to. She waited. Then she heard Silas's boots cross the kitchen floor above her, slow and uneven. And she heard him stop at the trap door, and she heard the rag rug being pulled aside, and she heard his voice say her name. Adelaide, come up. She came up the cellar stairs with Jonah pressed against her shoulder and her free hand on the rail, and she came up into the kitchen, and she saw what was in the kitchen. Zeke was leaning against the wall by the front window with his face the color of bone, but his eyes clear, and there was blood on the sleeve of his left arm where a bullet had grazed him. And the blood was not bad blood. It was the kind of blood that closes on its own with a clean bandage. Toby was sitting on the bench by the stove with his rifle across his knees and a long red line down the side of his face from his temple to his jaw, where a splinter of wood from the window frame had cut him. And his eyes, when he looked up at Adelaide, were the eyes of a man who had come back from somewhere very far. Silas was standing in the middle of the kitchen. He was holding his left hand against his right side just below the ribs, and the front of his shirt, under his hand, was dark and wet, and his face was the color of paper. His amber eyes found Adelaide's face and held. Mosley is in the yard, he said quietly. 2 of the others are out there with him. The 4th one is hit, but he is still on his feet somewhere by the barn. Toby will see to him. We are all right, Adelaide. The brothers are all right. I am not as all right as the brothers, but I am all right enough to walk to that bench if you will come and put your arm under mine. She did not even put Jonah down. She handed the baby across to Zeke without looking, and Zeke took him and Adelaide across the kitchen in 3 steps and put her arm under Silas's right side and walked him to the bench by the stove and sat him down on it. Then she pulled his shirt aside and looked at the wound. She had seen worse wounds. She had not seen many worse, but she had seen some. A bullet had gone through the meat of his side just above the hip bone and out the back, and it had not hit anything inside of him that she could see. And the bleeding was bad, but it was not the kind of bleeding that takes a man in an hour. It was the kind of bleeding that takes a man in 3 days if the wound goes bad, or the kind of bleeding that lets a man live the rest of his life if the wound is cleaned and packed and tended by somebody who knows what she is doing. Adelaide knew what she was doing. Toby, boil water, as much as the kettle holds. Zeke, bring me the whiskey bottle from the cabinet over the sink. Bring me the linen sheet from the top of the trunk in my room. Bring me the small needle case from my carpet bag and the spool of black thread. Move. The brothers moved. There was a second pistol shot from the yard, then very faint, and Toby went out the back door without a word and came back in less than a minute with his face set hard, and Adelaide did not ask and Toby did not say. The 4th man by the barn was no longer on his feet. The work on Silas took her almost 2 hours. She washed her hands in the boiled water until they were red. She washed the wound in the boiled water and then in the whiskey, and Silas's whole body went rigid on the bench, and a sound came out of his teeth that he did not let become a word. She probed the wound with her smallest finger to make sure no piece of cloth had been driven in, and she found none, and she packed it with clean linen, wet down with whiskey, and she stitched the front and the back closed with the small black thread, the kind of stitching she had learned from a sister at St. Margaret's, who had once been a battlefield nurse in the war, neat, tight stitches that would hold against fever. She bandaged it and bound it and helped the brothers carry Silas up the stairs to his bed and laid him down on his side so the wound would drain. She did not leave his bedside for the next 4 days. She slept in the chair beside his bed when she slept at all. She woke every 2 hours and put a fresh, cool cloth on his forehead. She spooned broth into his mouth when he could swallow and water into his mouth when he could not. The fever came up on the second night the way fever always comes up after a wound, and it was maha, and there was a long, bad hour around midnight on the third night when Adelaide thought she was going to lose him, and she sat with both her hands wrapped around his hot, dry hand on top of the blanket, and she said very quietly into the dim lamp-lit room, "Silas Calloway, you listen to me now. You listen carefully. I have just put your son back into this world, and I am not putting his father into the ground a year later. Do you hear me? You stay alive. You stay alive, and I will sort the rest of it out." Whether he heard her or not, she would never know. But the fever broke before dawn. On the morning of the fifth day, Silas opened his eyes and looked across the dim room and saw Adelaide asleep in the chair beside his bed, with her head fallen forward, and the small gold ring of his mother on her left hand, and he reached out with the hand that did not hurt, and laid 2 fingers on the back of her wrist, and Adelaide came awake instantly, the way mothers come awake. "Silas, Adelaide, you are still here." "I am still here." "How long?" "5 days. The fever broke before dawn this morning. You are going to live, Silas. Do you understand me? You are going to live." He closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he opened them again. "Adelaide, the thing I said to you in the front room before they came, about the ring." "Yes, Silas." "I meant every word of it. I meant every word of it more now than I did then. I wanted you to know, in case I have not been clear in the last 5 days, that I meant every word of it." "I know, Silas. I am wearing the ring." He looked at her hand on the blanket. He saw the small gold band on her finger. Something in his face that had been tight for the last 5 days came untied. "Adelaide, I'm going to ask you the proper question now. Right now, not in front of the brothers, just here in this room while I still might not have the chance later. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife? Will you stay in this house with me and with the point for the rest of our lives?" "Yes, Silas, yes, 1,000 times yes." He drew in a long, unsteady breath and let it out and closed his eyes again, and a tear came out of the corner of his closed eye and ran down across his temple into his hair, and Adelaide bent her face down and kissed the place on his forehead where the tear had come from. And that was the morning of the engagement in the dim lamp-lit upstairs bedroom of the long log house at the head of Bear Hollow, 4 mornings after Rance Mosley had ridden out of the world and into the ground in the front yard. The first storm of the long winter came down 5 days after that, and the morning came up white and very still over Bear Hollow. Adelaide stood at the kitchen window with a tin cup of coffee in her hands and looked out at a world she had never seen before. The valley had been green when she went to bed on the night they buried the 4 men in the high meadow above the creek. Now it was the color of bone china. The long meadow that ran down to the creek was a single unbroken sheet of new snow, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight up into a sky the color of pale steel, and the only sound in the whole great bowl of the mountains was the soft cracking of the fire behind her in the stove. She had been in this house for almost 10 weeks. She thought about that as she stood there. 10 weeks ago, she had been a girl on a coach in a navy blue traveling dress with a folded letter in her lap and $40 to her name. 10 weeks ago, she had not known the names of any of the men who slept under this roof. 10 weeks ago, she had not known the small weight of Jonah Calloway in her arms, or the way Silas Calloway's boots paused outside her door each night before they moved on. 10 weeks. It did not feel like 10 weeks. It felt like she had always been here. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned. It was Silas. He was moving slowly because his side was still healing, and he was leaning on the kitchen door frame more than he wanted her to know. But he was on his feet, and he had come down the stairs by himself, and his amber eyes in the gray morning light were the eyes of a man who was coming back into his own body day by day. "You are up early, Adelaide." "The snow woke me. I have not seen snow like this before." "Ishiarm, not on real snow. Boston snow is a different animal. Boston snow knows there are streets under it." He smiled at that. It was the first real smile she had seen him give since the morning of the fight. It changed his face entirely. The lines at the corners of his eyes shifted from the lines of grief to something else, something younger, something that had been there once and was learning how to be there again. Mountain snow does not care about streets, Adelaide. Mountain snow does what it wants. He came over to the stove and let her pour him a cup of coffee from the pot and stood beside her at the window. He did not touch her, but the small gold ring on her left hand was between them on the windowsill, and he laid one finger across it very lightly, and she understood the gesture and did not say anything. The winter that came down on Bear Hollow that year was the long one Tobias had promised. The first storm was followed by a second, and the second by a third, and by the middle of November, the road down to Lander was buried under 4 feet of snow, and the only way out of the valley was on snowshoes. The mail came once late in November, carried in by a half-frozen rider on a borrowed mule, and after that the mail did not come at all until the thaw. The 5 of them, Silas and Tobias and Ezekiel and Adelaide and Jonah Calloway, were sealed into the long log house by the white silence of the high country, and they began the slow work of becoming a family. Adelaide had thought before that winter that she knew what it was to live closely with other human beings. 8 years in a nursery had taught her many things about other people, but she had never lived with men. Not really. Not the way you live with men inside a house in winter. She had to learn in those first weeks the small unspoken rules of the place, where Silas hung his coat, which chair at the table was Tobias's chair, the fact that Zeke could not abide cold coffee and would pour out a whole cup rather than drink it lukewarm, the fact that Silas always took the heel of the bread and never explained why, the fact that Tobias hummed under his breath when he was working at a thing he loved, and that the song he hummed was always the same song, and that Adelaide came to recognize it and to find herself humming it back to him across the kitchen, sometimes without thinking. They taught her things in return. Silas taught her how to load and fire a rifle properly once his side had healed enough for him to stand at her shoulder behind the smokehouse on a windless afternoon in the first week of December. He showed her how the weight of the rifle should sit against her shoulder and how to breathe out before she pulled the trigger and how to forgive herself the first 3 shots that went wide. By the end of the afternoon, she could hit a tin can off a fence post at 30 paces, and the third time she did it, Silas laughed out loud, a great surprise bark of a laugh that startled a flock of pine grosbeaks out of the cedars at the edge of the corral, and Adelaide laughed with him, because the sound of his laugh was the most beautiful thing she had heard in a year. Tobias taught her the language of the woods. He took her on short walks along the creek when the weather allowed, and he showed her the tracks of a snowshoe hare, and the tracks of a marten, and the tracks of a great gray owl that had landed in the snow to take a vole, and had left the perfect imprint of its wings spread out on either side of the small dark hole where the vole had been. He showed her which berries in the dried bunches in his cabin were good for fever and which were good for grief, and he did not flinch when he said the word grief, and Adelaide understood that something in him was healing because she was there and that he wanted her to know it. Zeke taught her music after a fashion. He set the harmonica in her hands one evening by the fire and showed her how to draw a single clean note out of it, and she practiced for a week badly, and the brothers all bore her practicing with a patience she found almost unbearable. And on the 8th night she played the first 3 notes of an old hymn without faltering, and Zeke applauded her with both hands, and Silas pretended he had not been listening, and Tobias hid his smile behind his coffee cup, and Adelaide laughed until she cried. They read aloud from the books on the shelf every night without fail. They worked through David Copperfield from cover to cover that winter, taking turns by chapter, And Adelaide discovered that Silas's reading voice, when he allowed himself to use it, was a deep, slow voice that made the words on the page sound like they were being spoken in a church. She discovered that Tobias was a surprisingly funny reader of dialogue, with a different voice for each character, and that he could make his brothers laugh until the windows rattled. She discovered that Zeke read poetry better than anyone she had ever heard, and that on the night he read The Death of Dora aloud to them, she had to leave the room to compose herself, and when she came back, Silas was sitting in his chair with Jonah on his shoulder, and his own eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it from her own phone. And in the middle of all of that, Jonah Calloway grew. He grew the way babies grow when they are loved by 4 people at once. He gained 2 pounds in November and 3 more in December. He slept through the night for the first time in the second week of December, and Adelaide cried with relief when she woke at dawn and realized the cradle had been silent for 7 straight hours. He learned to hold his head up. He learned to push himself up on his small forearms and look around the room with the great solemn surprise of a baby who has just realized the world has corners. He learned to laugh at Tobias, who would make faces at him over the cradle when he thought no one was looking, and the sound of Jonah laughing at his uncle Tobias became that winter the bell that told the rest of the household where the baby was. In the 3rd week of March, on a morning when the light was beginning to have the thin yellow promise of spring in it, Adelaide was setting the table for breakfast when Jonah, propped up against a folded blanket in the corner of the kitchen, looked across the room at her and opened his small mouth and said very clearly the first word of his life, "Mama." Adelaide froze with a plate in her hand. He said it again, "Mama." The plate slipped out of her fingers and clattered onto the table. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and dropped to her knees in front of the blanket where he sat. And she gathered him up into her arms with hands that were shaking, and she pressed her cheek against the soft, warm crown of his head, and she tried to speak and could not. Silas had come in from the porch with an armful of stovewood at the exact moment of the first word. He was standing in the doorway with the wood still in his arms. He did not move. He did not put the wood down. He watched his son in his wife's arms because she was his wife, by then and everything but the saying of it, and he watched his wife weeping into the hair of his son, and he said very softly from the doorway, "Adelaide." She looked up at him. "He has chosen," Silas said. "He has chosen who his mother is. I want you to know that I choose the same." Adelaide could not answer. She held the small, warm body of Jonah Calloway against her chest, and she looked across the kitchen at the man in the doorway with the firewood in his arms, and the morning sunlight was coming in through the east window and falling on the floor in a long, bright bar between them. And she thought, this is the moment. This is the moment that the rest of my life will measure itself against. Then the letter came. It arrived on the 2nd day of April, carried up from Lander by the same half-frozen rider, on the same borrowed mule, only this time the rider was not half-frozen because the road was finally open, and he was the first man down out of the high country in 5 months, and he had a saddlebag full of mail to deliver. He stood on the porch of the long log house and pulled out a thick envelope addressed to Miss Adelaide Thornberry, care of Callaway Bear, Hollow, Wyoming Territory, and he tipped his hat and accepted the cup of coffee Adelaide pressed into his hand and wrote on. Adelaide stood in the kitchen with the envelope in her hands. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The paper was heavy, the kind of paper used by people who put paper to other uses than wrapping fish. The return address in the upper left corner read Phineas Ashcroft, Attorney at Law, Walnut Street, Philadelphia. She did not know any lawyers in Philadelphia. She did not know any people in Philadelphia. She had never set foot east of Boston in her life. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table with Silas and Tobias and Zeke, all watching her and pretending not to watch her. And she read the letter once, and then she read it a second time, and then she set it down on the pine boards of the table in front of her and put both her hands flat on top of it as though she were afraid it would fly away. "What does it say, Adelaide?" Zeke asked quietly. She could not look up. "It says that I had an uncle, a man named Bartholomew Thornberry, the brother of my father who I never knew existed. It says that he and my father quarreled when I was 4 years old, and he left Boston and went to Philadelphia and made his fortune in railroads. It says he died in February of this year. It says that he had no wife and no children, and he did not know whether his brother's daughter was still alive, but he had been trying to find me for the last 6 years through agencies in Boston and had only this winter learned that a girl named Adelaide Thornberry had left the St. Margaret home in early August of last year on a train heading west under a contract of marriage to a man in Wyoming territory. It says that he died before he could write to me himself. She drew a long, unsteady breath. It sees that he has left me his house in Philadelphia and his shares in the Pennsylvania Central Railroad and the contents of his accounts at the Girard Bank, and that the total estate after his debts are settled is somewhere very near $40,000. The kitchen went silent. $40,000 in 1883 was a fortune that did not have a shape Adelaide's mind could give it. It was the kind of money that bought houses with names. It was the kind of money that bought passage to Europe. It was the kind of money that ended every form of striving the world had ever required of her. It says that I must come to Philadelphia within 90 days to claim the estate, or it will be distributed to a list of charities in the city. It says that the firm of Phineas Ashcroft, attorney at law, will arrange travel and accommodation for me at the firm's expense, and that I have only to telegraph the office to set the journey in motion. She finally looked up. Silas was sitting across the table from her with his coffee cup forgotten in his hand. His face had gone very still. Tobias was leaning against the door frame of the kitchen with his arms folded, and his face was the face of a man who has watched a thing he loves prepare to leave the room. Zeke was sitting at her left, and Zeke alone of the three was looking at her with something like joy in his face, because Zeke alone was thinking only of her good fortune and not yet of what it would cost the rest of them. It was Silas who spoke first. Of course it was Silas. Adelaide, this is a very fine thing. This is a very fine thing for you. I want you to know before you say one word more that it is a very fine thing and that I am happy for you, and that no part of this house holds any claim on you. You should go to Philadelphia. You should take what is yours. You have earned it 10 times over by being who you are. Adelaide looked at him. Silas, you should go, Adelaide. A woman like you should not spend her life on a mountain in Wyoming territory. A woman like you should have rooms with carpets in them and dresses that have not been mended 7 times and friends who can quote Tennyson back at you when you read him aloud. That is the life you were born for. I can see it sitting on you. I have seen it sitting on you since the night at the Sweetwater Hotel. Adelaide felt something cold and very precise begin to move through her chest. She knew in that moment exactly what Silas Calloway was doing. He was doing the thing he had been raised to do. He was choosing what he believed to be her good over what he wanted, and he was doing it without flinching, the way a man chops wood in winter, the way a man carries a coffin to a grave. He was being honorable in the most expensive possible way, and he was breaking his own heart to do it, and he was going to make her watch. She did not let him finish. Silas Calloway, stop. He stopped. I am going to say a thing now, and I am going to say it once, and then I am not going to say it again, because if I say it twice, I will lose the courage to mean it. Do you understand me? He nodded slowly. I am 22 years old. I have been an orphan for 16 of those years. I have lived inside the walls of an institution for 16 of those years. I have held more babies than I can count, and not one of those babies was mine. I have never had a meal at a table with people who knew my middle name. I have never had a Christmas with people who would notice if I was not there in the morning. I came to Wyoming territory 8 months ago because I had nowhere else in the world to go, and because a letter from a stranger had used the word home in it, and I had not heard that word used in a sentence about me in 16 years. Silas's amber eyes did not move from her face. I have been in this house for 8 months. In those 8 months, I have been given a room of my own. I have been given a table to sit at. I have been given a child to raise, and 3 brothers to raise him with, and a fire to read books beside, and a mountain to be afraid of, and then not afraid of. I have been given a man who carried his mother's gold ring in his pocket for 3 days because he could not find a quiet enough hour to give it to me, and who finally gave it to me in the front room by the fire on the night before he was nearly killed in his own yard. In 8 months, I have been given everything I never had in 22 years. Do you understand me, Silas? I'm beginning to Adelaide. My uncle's money is not going to Philadelphia. My uncle's money is going to do the only thing my uncle's money should ever have been allowed to do. I am writing to Phineas Ashcroft tomorrow morning, and I am going to instruct him to liquidate the entire estate, every brick of the house, and every share of the railroad, and every dollar in the Girard Bank. And I am going to direct the proceeds into a fund. The fund is going to be called the Jonah Calloway Foundation for the Foundlings of the Western Territories. The fund is going to build orphanages in Cheyenne and Denver and Salt Lake City. The fund is going to put roofs over the heads of children whose mothers could not keep them and whose fathers were never named. And the fund is going to put books in their hands and warm meals in their bellies and people at their bedsides who will know their middle names. That is what my uncle's $40,000 is going to do. Not a single penny of it is going to be spent on a carpet for me in Philadelphia. Not one. Silas was staring at her. And as for me, Silas Calloway, as for me, I am staying on this mountain. I am staying in this house. I am staying at this table with you and your brothers and your son. Your son, who is now my son, too, because he chose me last month in this kitchen, and I chose him back. And there is no court in the world that has the power to undo a choosing like that. I am not going anywhere. The only question that matters in this room right now is whether you are going to ask me properly in front of your brothers the way you said you were going to ask me when you were lying in that upstairs bed with a fever in your blood and a stitched wound in your side. Because I told you then that I was going to make you do it properly, and I am holding you to it. There was a very long silence in the kitchen. Tobias by the door frame made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else, and then he turned his face toward the wall and his shoulders shook once. Zeke at her left was openly crying, and Silas Calloway across the table set down his coffee cup very slowly and stood up from his chair and walked around the table to where she sat and got down on one knee on the kitchen floor in front of her. Adelaide Thornbury, I am asking now in front of my brothers the way you wanted me to. Will you do me the great undeserved honor of being my wife? Will you stay in this house with me and with my son, who is now your son, and with my brothers, who are now your brothers? Will you let me try for the rest of my life to deserve what you walked up that mountain and gave us? Will you marry me, Adelaide? Adelaide reached out with both hands and took his face in them. His face was rough with 2 days of beard and warm and trembling very slightly under her palms. Yes, Silas. Yes, 1,000 times yes. She bent down. He came up. They met somewhere in the middle in the bar of bright April sunlight that was falling across the kitchen floor between them, and they kissed once very simply, the way two people kiss who have already been married inside their own heads for a long time and are only now getting around to telling the world about it. Behind them, Tobias had turned around again and was wiping his face openly with the back of his wrist, and Zeke had picked Jonah up out of his blanket in the corner of the kitchen and was holding the baby on his shoulder and saying very softly into the small ear, "Look at your mother and your father, son. Look at what your mother and your father just did. You remember this morning. You remember it for me when you are old." They were married 6 weeks later in the small white church in Landa on a Saturday in the middle of May. Tobias and Zeke stood up with their brother, one on either side of him. The minister was a tired old man who had been marrying mountain people in that church for 30 years. Jonah Calloway, 11 months old, sat in the lap of Mrs. Henrietta Pembroke, the young widow of the Lander liveryman, in the front pew. He did not cry once during the service. When his father said the words, "I do," the boy laughed, a great surprised gurgle of a laugh, and the whole congregation laughed with him. Outside the church afterward, in the bright May sunshine on the boardwalk, Adelaide stood in her plain white dress with her new husband on one side of her and her two new brothers on the other side of her and her son in her arms, and she looked up the long, dusty street of Lander, Wyoming, and she could not see for a moment because the tears were standing in her eyes. She had come down this street 9 months ago from the opposite direction on a coach in a dusty navy blue traveling dress with a folded letter in her lap and $40 to her name and a baby in her arms whose name nobody could yet say. Now she was walking back up it as Mrs. Silas Calloway of Bear Hollow with the same baby in her arms, and the baby's name was Jonah, and the baby had said her name first of any name in the world. The visitor came in the second week of November. The first hard snow of the new winter had fallen the day before, and Adelaide was sitting at the kitchen table cutting up a chicken for a stew when she heard the wagon on the road. She looked out the window. It was not a wagon she recognized. It was a hired rig from the Lander livery, the kind of rig the Pembroke widow rented out to travelers who had business up the valley and no horse of their own. A woman climbed down from the rig. She was perhaps 35 years old, dressed in a plain black traveling cloak and a black bonnet, the kind of clothes a respectable woman wore when she was traveling on a serious errand alone. She paid the driver something out of a small purse and turned and walked up to the porch with a deliberateness that made Adelaide's stomach go cold before she had any reason to know why. The knock came at the front door. Adelaide wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door and opened it. The woman on the porch was tall and thin, and her hair under the bonnet was the color of wet wheat. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky. There was something about the line of her cheekbone that made Adelaide put her hand on the doorframe to steady herself, because she had seen that line before in a photograph Silas had once shown her of his lost love. "My name is Beatrice Ashford Crane," the woman said quietly. "I have come from Cheyenne. I am Lily's older sister. I have come for my sister's son." Adelaide could not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Please come in, Mrs. Crane. Please come in out of the cold. There is a fire." She brought the woman inside and seated her at the kitchen table and put a cup of hot coffee in front of her and called Silas in from the barn. By the time Silas came through the back door with snow on his shoulders, Beatrice Ashford Crane had already begun to weep silently into the cup of coffee, and Adelaide was sitting beside her with her hand on the older woman's wrist, and Jonah was asleep in his cradle in the corner of the kitchen and did not yet know that his mother's sister had come for him. Beatrice told them her story in pieces. She had not known until October that her younger sister was dead. She had not known until October that there was a child. The Ashford family that had been scattered for years, the way frontier families are scattered, with one sister in Cheyenne and one in Wyoming territory, and a brother in Oregon, and another brother somewhere in the gold fields of California, and Lily had been the youngest, and the letters between them had grown thinner and thinner over the years, until they had stopped altogether. Beatrice had finally written to the Lander postmaster in September, asking for news of her sister, and the postmaster had written back with the news that Lily Ashford had died in childbirth in early June of last year and had been buried in the meadow above Bear Hollow by the man she had been planning to marry. The postmaster had also written that there was a child, a boy alive and living with his father. "I have not slept properly since I read that letter," Beatrice said quietly. "I am married. I have a husband in Cheyenne who is a good man. We have a house with 3 rooms and a kitchen garden. We have not been able to have children of our own. I came up here, Mr. Calloway, to ask you. I came up here to ask you to let me take my sister's son back to Cheyenne with me. He would have a mother who is his blood. He would have a father in my husband. He would have a real town to grow up in with a school and a church and other children. I can give him things you cannot give him alone in this valley. I am not here to accuse you. I am not here to say that you have failed him. I am here only to ask sister to sister with the woman who has been keeping him alive whether you would consider it." Silas had been standing very still by the back door the whole time she spoke. His face was the face Adelaide had seen on the boardwalk in Lander on the evening she met him, the face of a man whose composure was a built thing, held together by force of will, and the building was beginning to crack. It was Adelaide who spoke first. "Mrs. Crane, I want to tell you a thing before my husband says anything, and I want to tell you it as one woman who loves Jonah to another woman who loves Jonah, because that is what we both are, and there is no point in pretending otherwise. Beatrice nodded. I am not Jonah's mother by blood. You are right about that. Lily was his mother by blood, and you are Lily's sister, and that means there is a piece of Jonah that belongs to you, and that will always belong to you, and I would never try to take that from you. I am Jonah's mother by something else. I am his mother because I sat with him on a coach for 4 hours when he was 8 weeks old and almost dead, and I gave him sugar water from a torn strip of my own sleeve because nobody else on that coach knew how to keep him alive. I am his mother because he chose me by the cradle in this kitchen on a March morning, and I chose him back, and I have been choosing him every day since. There are two kinds of mother in the world, Mrs. Crane. There is the mother who gives a child to the world, and there is the mother who keeps the child in the world. Lily was one of those. I am the other. Both of them are real. Neither of them cancels the other one out. Beatrice had begun to cry again quietly into her coffee. Silas crossed the kitchen and laid his hand on his wife's shoulder. He looked across the table at Beatrice Ashford Crane. Mrs. Crane, I want to thank you for coming up that road in the snow to ask me. You did not have to ask. You could have written a letter from a lawyer. You came in person, and that is the act of a woman who is doing a hard thing the right way. I want you to know I see it. He drew in a breath. My answer is no. The boy stays here. He stays here because his name is Jonah Calloway, and his father is sitting at this table, and his mother is sitting at this table, and his uncles are out in the barn, and the cradle he sleeps in was carved by my own hands in the weeks before he was born. The boy stays here. But your sister's blood is in his veins, and that means you are in his veins too. And I am not the kind of man who pretends a thing is not true, because the truth is inconvenient. So here is what I am offering you instead. You will be his aunt. You will be his aunt the way an aunt is supposed to be. You will come up to this house every summer for as long as you can travel, and you will stay as long as you want to stay. And Jonah will know your face from the time he can know any face. And he will know that he had a mother who could not stay in this world long enough to hold him, and that her name was Lily Ashford, and that she is buried in the meadow above this house under a marker. I cut myself, and he will know that she had a sister who loved him so much, she came up the mountain in November to ask for him. He will know all of that because his mother, who is sitting beside you now, will tell him every year of his life, and so will I, and so will his uncles. That is what I am offering you. It is not what you came for, but it is the most honest thing I can offer. Beatrice Ashford Crane sat in the kitchen of the Calloway house with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and her face wet, and she looked across the table at the woman who was going to be raising her sister's son, and she looked at the man who had spoken to her with the careful generosity of a person who had not been expecting kindness at his back door in November, and she nodded slowly. I will come, she said. I will come every summer. I will come for as long as I am able. Thank you, Mrs. Calloway. Thank you, Mr. Calloway. You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever, and you did not have to. Adelaide stood up and walked around the kitchen table and put her arms around Beatrice Ashford Crane, and the two women stood there in the warm kitchen with the cradle in the corner and the snow falling outside the window, and they wept together for the woman they had both loved and for the boy they were both going to share. And when they let each other go, Adelaide carried Jonah out of his cradle and put him in the arms of his aunt for the first time, and Beatrice held him as carefully as a thing made out of glass. And Jonah opened his eyes and looked up at the unfamiliar face above him and did not cry. That was how the Calloways and the Ashfords made their peace. Beatrice stayed 3 days at Bear Hollow and rode back down to Lander on the fourth morning, and she came again the following June, and the June after that, and every June after that for 15 years, until age and arthritis kept her in Cheyenne. Jonah grew up calling her Aunt B, and on the wall of his bedroom, from the time he was old enough to keep things on a wall, there was a small frame photograph Beatrice had brought up on her second visit, a picture of two girls in the white dresses standing in a Cheyenne photographer's studio in the year 1875. The older girl with her arm around the shoulders of the younger, and the younger girl with the same wet, wheat hair, and the same line of cheekbone that her son would carry into the world 7 years later. Lily, his mother by blood, the woman who had wanted him to be named Jonah. The years that came after that came down on Bear Hollow, the way the seasons come down on any frontier valley, slow and steady and full of small, ordinary things that turn looking back into the substance of a life. In the spring of 1885, Adelaide gave birth to her first daughter, a girl with honey hair and her mother's cornflower eyes. And Adelaide named her Lillian Rose because Adelaide had decided long before that the first daughter would carry the name of the woman who had carried Jonah and Silas Calloway, who had been pacing the porch in the snow when the cry of the new baby came through the upstairs window, sat down on the porch boards and put his face in his hands and wept, the way he had not let himself weep since the morning Lily had died 3 years before, because the wheel had come round, because the loss had been answered, because his daughter was alive and his wife was alive, and the long bad year that had begun in June of 1882 was finally truly over. In the summer of 1886, Tobias Calloway married Henrietta Pembroke, the young widow who had held Jonah on her lap in the front pew at Silas and Adelaide's wedding 3 years before. They had been circling one another quietly for those 3 years in the slow, respectful way of two people who had each buried a love and were not going to rush a second one. And on a June afternoon when Hetty had ridden up to Bear Hollow with a basket of preserves she had made from the Pembroke plum tree, Tobias had walked her down to the creek after supper and asked her to be his wife. She had said yes. They were married in the same little church in Lander on the first Saturday of August. Tobias built a small house with his own hands a half-mile up the slope from the main Calloway house in the autumn of that year, and he and Hetty raised 2 daughters in it. The older, a serious, dark-eyed girl named Mary Ellen, and the younger, a wild, laughing thing named Susanna, who could ride a horse before she could properly walk. In the spring of 1887, Adelaide and Silas had a son. They named him Theodore after Adelaide's father, a man Adelaide had not been old enough to remember well, but whose name she had carried in her own name all her life and wanted to give to her child. Theo was a quiet boy from the moment he came into the world, a watcher of things, the kind of boy who would later become the brother who could fix any broken thing on the ranch with a length of wire and a piece of patience. Ezekiel Calloway never married. He was offered the position of director of the new orphanage in Lander in the spring of 1884, the first orphanage built with the money of the Jonah Calloway Foundation, and he took the position and he moved into a small set of rooms above the big main hall, and he spent the rest of his life in that work. He was 29 years old when he took the post, and he was 67 when he finally laid it down. And in those 38 years, he saw more than 400 children come through the doors of the Wind River Home for Foundlings, and there was not one of them whose middle name he did not know, and there was not one of them who left the home without a wool coat and a pair of boots and a small carved wooden animal that Zeke had whittled himself in the long evenings by the fire. He came up to Bear Hollow every Sunday for dinner all of those 38 years. He never missed a Sunday unless one of the children at the home was sick. The children of Bear Hollow would say years later, the best uncle a child ever had. In the spring of 1890, Adelaide gave birth to her last child, a girl they named Cora June, after Silas's mother. By then, there were 4 children running through the long log house at the head of Bear Hollow, and the kitchen that had once held only the silence of a man who had not been able to say his son's name was now the loudest room in the territory, with the bang of pots and the laugh of small children and the slow, patient voices of the brothers reading aloud by the fire of an evening. The Jonah Calloway Foundation built its second orphanage in Cheyenne in 1885, and its third in Denver in 1888, and its fourth in Salt Lake City in 1891. By the time Adelaide was 30 years old, more than 200 children whose mothers could not keep them and whose fathers were never named were sleeping under Calloway Foundation roofs, and Adelaide Thornberry Calloway had become, without ever once setting foot east of Boston after the day she left it, one of the quiet, legendary women of the Wyoming Territory, the kind of woman whose name was known in every nursery in 3 Western capitals. She did not care about being known. She cared about the children, and about her own children, and about the man she had married. and about the brothers who had become her brothers, and about the long log house in the green valley between the two arms of the Wind River Mountains. On a June evening in 1893, 11 years after the morning, the coach had pulled into Lander with a crying baby in it. Adelaide and Silas sat together on the porch of the long log house in Bear Hollow and watched the sun go down behind the western peaks of the Wind River Range. The children were inside, all four of them, and the kitchen window was open, and the sound of their voices and their small fights and their laughter came out to the porch in the soft June air. Jonah Calloway, 11 years old now, was teaching his younger brother Theo how to whistle through a blade of grass, and Theo was failing at it, and Lillian Rose was telling them both they were doing it wrong while she did it perfectly herself, and Cora June was singing a song she had made up that had no melody and no ending, and that nobody but Cora June would ever sing again. Silas reached over and took Adelaide's hand the way he had taken it at the kitchen window on the morning of the first snow 11 years ago. Do you remember the crying on the coach, Adelaide? Every single day. That was the morning my life began. That was the morning mine began, too. They sat there for a long time without saying anything more. The sun went down behind the western peaks. The valley filled up with the long blue shadow that comes before the dark in the high country. Inside the kitchen window, the laughter of the children went on and on, the music of a song that had been waiting a long time to be sung. And somewhere far below in the valley, an owl called once across the meadow, the same thin, clear note Adelaide had heard that first night in the parlor of the Sweetwater Hotel, and she understood finally and completely that she had been listening for that note her whole life, and that it had been calling her home. She was home. She had always been home. She had only needed to come up the mountain to find out.